The 10 things that have surprised me about the GoPro Hero 7 Black. Now, we've been lucky enough to spend the past month with the GoPro Hero 7 Black doing some videos and some reviews on it. And before our time's up with it, I wanted to give my honest feedback on what that experience has been like, looking at the 10 things that have most surprised me, both in the good, the bad, and probably the ugly as well. So let's get straight into it and look at the good bits of the GoPro Hero 7 Black. Now, first up is the Hyper Smooth. Now, before we got this camera, that was all we heard about, how good the Hyper Smooth stabilization is with this. It's gimbal-like, it's buttery smooth. And I, being myself, was a little bit skeptical, a little bit cynical of how good it would actually be. But oh my days, it is absolutely incredible. It's actually shocking how good it stabilizes the footage. Now, we tested this side by side in one of our videos with the DJI Osmo, and although the GoPro is a very different proposition to the Osmo, which is a stabilized all-in-one camera, it actually stood up. In fact, I'd say the stabilization was at times better than the Osmo. Now, for those that don't know, it works by cropping into the footage 10%. So you lose 10% of the image size, but really that's not anything to worry about when the stabilization from it is as good as it is. There's no digital artifacts, there's no signs of any kind of warping or stabilizing actually happening. It's just reliable and buttery smooth. Audio quality, now it's something that's very close to my heart and something I'm very hard on with any bit of camera equipment. And in my first review of this, I was actually quite harsh on it. I was quite negative on the audio quality from this camera. But with using it a little and having actually had to edit with the camera, if you spend a little bit of time in post-production, adding a little bit of EQ and compression, the audio quality from this is actually really good. It's fully passable. I'd say the audio quality is as good as a DSLR with a Rode video mic. In fact, in some of the videos that we used both of those side by side, we used the microphone from the GoPro over the Rode video mic. It was that good. That's not to say that it's perfect. It's far from perfect. It does still sound a little bit like a GoPro, but the improvement they've made from the models previous is leaps and bounds ahead. The audio quality is actually really very good. The image quality is one of the things that has really surprised me, and I will say this with a little bit of caution. The image quality at normal frame rates is really very good. There'll be more on lower frame rates later, but just looking at your standard 24, 25 or 30 if you're in America frames per second, this is actually stunning. It's the first action camera that I've used that doesn't feel like an action camera. The image is still fisheyed at 4K for sure, but you can make it linear at lower resolutions. The flat image profile and the dynamic range you get out of it would actually stand up side by side to any cheaper DSLR or mirrorless camera. It really is that good. It is the first action camera that I've enjoyed filming with. And the final good bit for me was the touchscreen. Now, anyone that's been using GoPros for long enough will remember the dark days when they didn't have any kind of reviewing screen at all. It was literally a case of point and shoot, and you were totally blind until you got the footage back into your computer. So to have a bright, colourful review monitor on the back is something that's a welcome addition, and one that I hope stays for all GoPro models, not just the Hero 7. The fact that there's a touchscreen as well makes the user interface really accessible and available to use. I wouldn't say necessarily easy, but more on that later. But to have an inbuilt screen for you to be able to frame your shot, make sure that the lighting's correct, and also to review your shot at the end is absolutely a welcome addition to this camera. So with that, let's look at the bad bits of the GoPro Hero 7 Black. The first up is the super slow motion and how garbage the image looks when you're in 240 or 200 FPS. It is atrocious. Now, I guess they're dealing with the limitations of how much data they can actually store on an SD card, so each frame gets compressed that more, but the digital compression and the low bitrate look to each frame is very noticeable. It's almost like the whole thing has a huge amount of ISO gain on it. That really noisy digital artifacting that happens that's just very unpleasant to look at. The only way to combat that is to film at super slow-mo at those 200 FPS in perfect daylight conditions where the camera's not having to do any heavy lifting at all. But even then, there's still a noticeable amount of noise. Sure, it's usable for the couple of seconds that you're going to be using super slow motion for, but it is far and away underwhelming compared to the image quality that you'd get at normal frame rates. Next up was the user interface and the just general user experience of the GoPro. That touchscreen, the menu options, the slide from the top and the bottom is possibly the most infuriating experience you'll have with any camera. I think the GoPro Hero 7 Black made me swear more than any camera we've ever used here. It's fiddly, it's hard to use, and sure, it's a bright display with clear options, but quite often you'll click on the wrong thing or you'll need to slide from the top and you can't get out of that menu in any kind of intuitive way without pressing a side button and that'll close the camera. It is just hard to use. There's so many options and so many functions within the camera that has a screen this small, it makes it hard and kind of unenjoyable to use. That becomes especially true when you're working in a little bit of a rush, when you're actually on location shooting any kind of action, which, you know, it is an action camera after all. Those higher stress environments make this camera even harder to use and unfortunately at times unbearable to use. Now with the user experience in mind takes me on to the next key point, which is why does the screen turn itself off? Why? Why does it turn itself off? I went through the menu and it's probably an option in there to stop it doing that somewhere. I couldn't find it intuitively, but it does turn itself off either when it's just in idle or even halfway through recording. Now I assume it's a way to save battery life and to stop it overheating as much, but it's infuriating when you're in the middle of a shot and you're using it to frame and suddenly the screen goes black. Now you're not sure if it's still recording or not, so you're looking at the front for the little red flashing light. The whole thing is a bit of a mess really. The simple way around it would be to simply have an option to have the screen on or not all the time, if that is the issue, but to have it randomly switch off on you halfway through a shot is just infuriating. Now next up is the battery life, which is appalling. It really is appalling. They come with a 1200 milliamp hour battery, which on face value seems like quite a lot, but in reality that gives you around 45 minutes if you're lucky shooting. If you're shooting any kind of slow motion stuff, say that 200 frames per second, then it's even less. So if you're going out and about with the GoPro Hero 7 Black, you're gonna need 2, 3, probably 4 batteries to get a decent day's worth of filming out of it. And finally is the fact that it gets so hot, it's unreal. We were actually shocked at the amount of heat this thing produces. And now I guess that's just a design feature. The heatsink is the body itself and that's how it cools itself down internally. But I would worry about leaving this on for extended periods of time. For argument's sake, if you wanted to leave it up to catch a time lapse for a whole day, I would be nervous that the whole thing would overheat and shut down. It gets uncomfortably hot after a couple of hours. And for a camera that costs around £400, that's incredibly unnerving. So after a whole month of spending a huge amount of time with this camera, I can honestly say that it's not just my favorite action camera of all time, but it's also my favorite camera of recent times as well. It truly represents a huge amount of value, even at that around £400 price point. It goes far beyond being a simple action camera and into the realms of being a full multimedia machine. I would recommend it for people that are vlogging for a first time. I'd also recommend it for anyone that makes any kind of content for any kind of platform, be that Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, you name it. If you're taking photos or videos, I think everyone should have this camera in their arsenal. So after a whole month of using this little guy, I'll be truly sad to say goodbye to it when we have to send it off to our lucky competition winner. But with that in mind, we're going to be going straight out and buying one ourselves. In fact, we'll probably end up buying 2 or 3. They are that good. And even with those bad points in mind that I've mentioned, I would still thoroughly recommend this to anyone that's making any kind of video. So that's been my grab and go review style. Thanks for watching and I'll see you next time.